Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Data Visualizations, Tips to Connect with Your Audience and Deliver Powerful Insight. My name is Andrew. I'm part of the marketing department here at Verimed. Before I hand off to our very talented presenters in Francesca, Hugh, and Sarah, I'd just like to share a few little ground rules for everyone. You'll notice your mics and cameras are turned off. So if you have any questions, then please direct them towards the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll save answering questions for the end of the webinar where we've allocated some time, but please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section as they'll be saved for the end. Also, if you're having any issues with sound or video, please drop them in that Q&A tab. I'll be able to raise it with the tech support right away. And lastly, you can download a brochure in the handouts tab on the right-hand side of the screen. We can learn a little bit more about our services. And just to let you know, we'll be sharing a recording of this presentation with you this week. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Francesca.
Hi everyone, welcome. So my focus for this part of the webinar is going to be staying consistent with your insight and driving home your message, and then matching your visualization to your audience needs. And to me, these two items go hand in hand. So my presentation today is going to be an amalgamation of both of these concepts. Then we're going to move on to Hugh and Sarah, and they're going to present making your data pop and then maximizing audience engagement. So we can see from these topics how they're all related to each other and how they also follow on from our previous webinar where Reese presented his diary data and ways that can be visualized. So as I said, for my part of the webinar, we're going to look at data visualization from a different perspective. We're going to see data visualization as an enabler, and that's an enabler to creating efficiencies, driving successful communication, and being able to disseminate results and information with different stakeholders. But before I delve a bit deeper into the main crux of this talk, I think it's important that I give some context into the work that I do and the colleagues that I work with. So my main role is as a launch statistician, where I tend to focus on writing statistical analysis plans and programming specs for any ad hoc and post hoc analyses that comes after any phase 3 trial. So this means that I tend to work with a lot of stakeholders across the business, and a lot of my job is to really tease apart and understand what it is they want so that I can then translate that into an analysis plan. And it's through these interactions that has really prompted this talk today. So who are these stakeholders that I'm talking about? Usually they're non-statisticians by trade, but obviously they do possess an excellent understanding of statistical concepts. But in pharma, as you know, we really do work with a lot of different people, and they have a whole array of different experiences and expertise. So my talk today isn't so much aimed at non-statisticians. It is very much for everyone, and hopefully it will be useful in many different situations. And as one of the agenda items says, we need to be able to drive home our message and have it aligned with our audience. So these different stakeholders that we work with. So how do we match a data visualization to what our audience actually wants? And how can we use this to drive home our message? Well, I'm hopefully going to be able to answer these questions with a case study. And that is the case study of the never-ending outputs. And this is going to be in the context of a post hoc analysis. So when I talk about a post hoc analysis, I mean one that's not so much for submission purposes, but it could be for, a medical perspective, a market access perspective, or even for publication. So I thought here I would just go through what a typical post hoc analysis process entails. So first of all, we have our stakeholder. They have a research question that they want answered. So then it will come to us as the statisticians, which then opens a dialogue between themselves and us so that both sides can understand what the ask actually is. when that dialogue has happened, we, the statisticians, will develop the analysis plan, the programming spec, which will then get sent to the programming team. They'll do their magic, the outputs will be produced, and then it will come back to us as the statisticians. And this is where we'll then do our due diligence. So we'll cross-check numbers with any, TFLs, CSRs, what other evidence we have. Once that's all good and we're happy with that, we will then disseminate that information back to the stakeholders, and voila, mission accomplished. So while it may seem like a simple process, I think we all know it's never going to be as simple as this. So there can be a number of issues that arise during this process, and we need to make sure that the right message and the right insights are being delivered consistently when we're working with different people who, could be in different teams across the business. We need to make sure that things are clear and easy to understand for people of all levels and expertise. So this brings me on to a wee poll that we have, and I'm going to start it now. So hopefully you can all see that pop up onto your screen. So the poll is, what do you think would be the biggest pain point in this post hoc analysis process? Is it going to be multiple stakeholders? Is it going to be the fact that there's just too much going on? Is it going to be an issue with prioritization? Or could it be that the outputs themselves are too large? So I will give you just another few seconds to get your responses in. I'll just give it a wee moment. So I can see the responses coming in. And it's interesting what people are choosing. Oh, okay. Okay, so I've got a fair amount few now. So this is your last call to get your response in. I'm going to close the poll now and continue on with the presentation. So everyone kind of chose one of all of these. So as we can see that there are going to be multiple barriers which can happen at any stage. So going on to the first point here is multiple stakeholders. So when we have multiple stakeholders, who is actually going to own each of these requests? Then another issue we can face is having multiple requests at once. So then what is actually the priority? And I think it's imperative that we balance business critical needs versus what the nice to haves are. And then with having a lot going on at once, we can succumb to having requests for literally everything and anything, which end up not being used. And unfortunately, this can happen quite a lot in practice. So this means that we can end up with wasted resources in terms of programming, for example, and ultimately it adds to our already increasing carbon footprint. But as our case study is the volume of outputs, what I want to delve deeper into is what happens with what seems like a simple ask does bring back hundreds of pages of outputs. So this this last point circles me back nicely to talking about this. So having outputs that are hundreds of pages of long, let's be honest, really isn't that helpful and is really not that easy to understand. And on top of this, will every page of that output, will it actually be used? Is it going to end up in the story? Will it be for a manuscript, a poster? Is it just for internal communications? So there's a huge carbon footprint that we leave in our wake with every table, every program, and every effort that's put into these. And it is a shame when this can lie forgotten. So we're coming on to my favorite slide here. When you're going through these requests, it can, there's tables coming at you, flying at you from every angle, every direction. And sometimes what seems like a simple ask of, could you rerun these baseline characteristics for these subgroups, please? Can you rerun these primary efficacy analysis for these subgroups as well? Oh, and while you're at it, can you rerun the responder analyses? So while the table themselves are simple enough, it's the sheer volume of output that is the issue. And that's not just overwhelming for stakeholders, but that's also overwhelming for us as statisticians because it's not easy to trudge through a lot of that data. So how can we stop that from happening? How can we reduce our carbon footprint? How can we reduce outputs to those that are going to actually be of use? How can we make it easier for dissemination and interpretation? How do we go the extra mile? What can we do to improve? What can we do that's going to actually help weave the story for the asset? And I think also what's important is how can we show ourselves off and exercise our creativity and our statistical abilities? Well, here's an idea that my team and I came up with that in the long run has saved a lot of effort, a lot of resources, and a lot of unnecessary outputs from being produced. But just before I go into the app, I'm going to explain a little bit of the ask from us, from the stakeholders that we were working with. So they were interested in certain tables to be rerun for different parameters. So for us, these were disease severity scores for different populations, for different subgroups, and for the multiple treatment arms that we had in the trial. Then, as I alluded to earlier, this then magnified into, while you're doing that, can we have the same for the responder analysis? So again, for multiple outcomes and responder definitions for the same set of subgroups. So with this, we knew straight away that while it was going to be an easy enough task, it's easy enough to write up the analysis plan, it's easy enough to understand the tables themselves. What was going to be the hard part was actually trying to get through that amount of data and that amount of outputs and actually being able to notice, any particular trends, any patterns. So it did seem impossible to try and make any sort of comparisons. So yeah, we really had to think outside of the box here and come up with a solution that was going to be useful for everyone. And this was when we had commissioned an R Shiny app to be made. So instead of just tables, we graphed certain things over time. And I think as well, these kind of visuals, it was going to be much easier to be able to spot trends and actually understand what the key messages were going to be. So I'm going to go to the app now so I can show you what I'm talking about. But for fear of doing it live, I took a screen recording instead, just to be on the safe side. So you should now see a screen recording of the app that we commissioned. So the app that we had looked a little bit different. We did have to kind of take this back down to the basics here just to remove any client information here. So this is all dummy data that we've redone the app with. But as you can see on the left-hand side, we have two radio buttons. So, you can choose your change from baseline or the responder rates. Then you've got a drop-down menu for the parameters. So this for us was our disease severity scores. You can have a number in there, the different populations that you want to compare, and also the different subgroups that you want to compare. So once you've picked what you want to look at, you can submit the selection, and then on the right-hand side, the graphs and the tables are going to update to the specifications that you want. And I think this is in itself really powerful because all the information itself is there. We've got the tables underneath so that if you want to look at a particular number, a particular time, you can. But instead of having a table, having the graphs themselves is what really made the difference for us, is just being able to see what's happening over time, what are the key messages going to be, what are we actually going to be able to tease out from, all this information. And I think as well, when just switching between the different analyses here, you can see the sheer amount that you can include in a Shiny app like this. And I would say one of the other biggest important things that we got off the back of doing this was actually being able to take the stakeholders through this at the same time as us. So instead of just getting, a whole host of tables and graphs back and then sending it along to the stakeholders, we were actually able to walk through with them and, brainstorm ideas, talk about what we would see. We could then balance what was interesting to them, but also keep what was statistically sound at the same time. So yeah, for us, this was a really, really important app, and I think you can see the potential and like how far you can take something like this as well. So yeah, I'm just got another couple of slides here before I hand off to Hugh and Sarah. So I'll go back to the slides now. And what I think I touched on when I was going through the screen recording there was there's lots of different benefits to having a dashboard like this. So one of them is no longer having to sift through hundreds of pages of outputs. It just makes it a lot easier to visualize a lot of data at once. And again, the biggest thing is it's easier for stakeholders to understand. It's easier for interpretation and being able to actually see what the key messages are going to be. And then off the back of that, easier to find trends and any patterns in the data, which you can see a lot better from, some sort of visualization rather than just from a table. Also, as I spoke about, it was one of the benefits was being able to actually walk through the results with the stakeholders and take them through each visual, which I think helps facilitate agreements on key messages that are then statistically sound. And again, it helps generate that dialogue, and I think it helps everyone align on what the direction of the story is going to be. And because it's all in a dashboard, then there's lots of efficiencies already on this slide, but it helps lower the carbon footprint, because instead of having every single one of those printed off or saved in a PDF, what we can then do, if there's anything in particular that they were really interested in, that was the table that we would print off. So 1, 2, 3 pages. We weren't going to be printing off 500 pages of absolutely everything, with most of it not being relevant. So yeah, that in itself just reduced the carbon footprint. And lastly, I think for us as statisticians, it allowed us to be creative and to really think outside of the box, which I also think helps create trust and respect as well. So yeah, my last slide here was just trying to touch upon things that we found helped make this process more efficient. So first of all is having that discussion about what actually is the priority and being able to align with any sort of strategy that at the global level, the asset level, or even the company level. And off the back of that, being able to agree on the order of how they should actually be programmed and how they should be done. And I think as a statistician, it's also really important that we know our TFLs and our CSRs inside out, because then we can link back to what they want with what's already available. Because a lot of the time they can ask for things that are actually in the data somewhere and is in the output somewhere. And as a statistician, we need to be able to know exactly what we have so that we can then say, we already have that, which again creates these efficiencies. And then another thing is, are you able to combine certain requests? Are there any from like different stakeholders that might be similar? That's then a good chance to, kill two birds with one stone. I think another important one here that I've written down is have the stakeholders themselves own the requests, so that us as statisticians, we might have questions further down the line, and it's then good to be able to go back to that person and ask them, for any sort of advice or suggestions, whatever it may be. And another important one is making sure that there's clear rationales for each of these requests. So we want to know exactly why it's needed and how it's going to be used, which again, I think just links back with everything else in this slide about discussing what's the priority in the order that things should be done in. And then lastly, again, thinking outside of the box, try and think of visualizations instead of tables. Make it insightful, make it snazzy, make it really fun to look at. So yeah, that is all from me. So thank you very much for listening. And now I'm going to hand over to Hugh and Sarah.
Thanks, Francesca. Hi, everyone. We're now going to move to the second part of the webinar, which will be hosted by me and Sarah. And this part of the webinar is on how to make your data pop, where we're going to talk about several different tips and tricks. that you can use to make your data visualizations easy to understand, as well as aesthetically pleasing. So what makes a data visualization pop? A great data visualization doesn't just present data, it also helps its target audience to understand that data and its implications in a particular context. To do this, data visualizations need to be designed to make the meaning of the data as clear as possible to the audience, and this can be achieved by considering several different aspects during the design process. In this webinar, we've grouped together those aspects into 3 categories which we'll go through, and then at the end, we'll put together all those tips and tricks into a case study where we'll give a graph a makeover and show how it can be improved from start to finish. The first category that we'll go through will give tips and tricks on how you can create structure within your visualization, which is all about showing how you can create a clear hierarchy among a graph's different components. Then Sarah will go through the second category, where she will show how different elements within a visualization can be shown to be related or grouped together. And then I'll go through the final category, where I'll give tips and tricks on how you can improve the clarity of your visualizations. And that part focuses on how you can help the audience to understand your visualizations easily, avoid any confusion or misinterpretation, as well as how to create a more aesthetically pleasing visualization. So yeah, I'll now go through the first section of this part of the webinar where I'll talk about tips and tricks on creating structure within your visualizations. So one of the easiest ways that you can help the audience to understand your visualization is by creating a hierarchy among its different elements. And what I essentially mean by that is coming up with a way to signal to the audience the relative importance of each part of the visualization. And what that means is that just from looking at your visualization, an audience can instinctively know what the most important information is, as well as what the least important information is. So this kind of signaling isn't something that an audience might be like directly conscious of, but when it comes to designing a data visualization, it's a great way of giving the visualization a bit of a narrative structure, as an audience will typically begin by looking at the items that are given the most importance and then move to items which give less importance. So for this part of the webinar, we're going to use this visualization as a starting point. So the graph that you can see is just a simple box plot showing the distribution of weight by different racial groups for a fictional study. So if you haven't come across box plots before, a box plot shows the minimum and maximums of a particular variable, as well as the medium and lower and upper quartiles of that variable. So that variable in this instance is the weight. So our first tip for creating structure within a visualization is to think about the alignment of the text. So typically in the West, our eyes move from left to right when we're reading, which means that items placed in the top left are given much more importance than items placed in the bottom right. This is something that you can apply in visualizations. So for example, you can place the most important information, such as the title, in the top left, whereas you can also place the least important information, such as any footnotes, for instance, in the bottom right. One of the thing that we've done in this visualization that you can see on the screen is that we've aligned the x-axis label to the left as well, because this is just one way of giving it more importance in the visualization so that the audience notices it much more than when it was previously center aligned, and it also helps to create a cleaner and sharper look for the visualization. So related to our first point about the position of the text, it can also be helpful to think about the position of the data as well, if it's possible to order or sort it. So in the previous visualization that you saw, the box plots were in no particular order, whereas here we've ordered them by medium weight. So this is just one way of creating a clearer visualization, as it now becomes easier to make comparisons between the different racial groups, which also helps to give the visualization more a narrative flow, as the audience will typically begin by looking at the box plot which is ordered at the top and then move to the box plots ordered at the bottom. But again, ordering or sorting the data isn't appropriate or possible in all contexts, but when it is appropriate and when it is possible, it can really help to give a visualization a cleaner and sharper look to help the audience to quickly understand it and its implications. So our next tip for creating structure within a visualization relates to the size of the text. So we typically associate larger text size with increased importance. So as is often done in lots of different mediums, such as articles, in this visualization, we've made the title bigger than the other text on the graph, just to give it more importance within the visualization. And you can also use it in the other way. So here we've made the footnote in the bottom right smaller than the other text on the visualization, which gives it less importance in the visualization. So it's just one way of kind of signaling to the audience the relative importance of each different part. So our final tip in this section of the webinar is to do with the use of color. So bolder and more saturated colors attract much more attention than gray muted ones, which can then gives them more importance within the visualization. So in the visualization that you can see on the graph, we've made the title, the x-axis label, and the racial group titles much more bold, which attracts the audience attention. Whereas in contrast, we've made the footnote and the reference lines more muted and more gray, so that while they're still present and you can still make them out and interpret them, they slightly fade in the background, which helps the audience to focus on other parts of the visualization that you want them to look at. So following on from the use of color in text, color can also be an effective way of signaling importance within the data as well. So the colored box plot that you now see was previously unremarkable from the others, but here the bright blue color that we've given it makes it the centerpiece of the visualization without even having to explain why it is important. So color is probably the most effective way of implying importance within a visualization, but it is also something that should be used sparingly, as if you have too many colors on one visualization, it can create an overly busy look, which makes it instinctively hard for the audience to know where to look and what to concentrate on. So before I hand over to Sarah for the next section of tips, here's a quick before and after this visualization. So hopefully you can see how just a few tweaks to the position, size, and colors of different elements in the visualization has made a really big difference in terms of how easily it can be interpreted, as well as how much more aesthetically pleasing it is.
Thanks, Hugh. So now I'll be showing you techniques that you can use to suggest group elements within your visualization. The main benefit to doing this is that it reduces the audience's mental effort when interpreting the graph. So a great way to suggest groups within your data is by using the Gestalt principles of visualization. These are a set of ideas about information processing and pattern recognition from 20th century psychology. To demonstrate each idea, I've included a picture, but I'll quickly talk you through each of them as well. So first, we've got connection, which is the idea that elements that are physically connected are associated. Next, we've got proximity, so elements that are close to each other are associated and separate from those further away. Next, we've got closure. Elements within a common boundary are seen as more related than elements placed either side of the boundary. Next, we've got similarity. Elements that are similar by, e.g., color, shape, or size are seen as associated and separate to those not the same. Next, enclosure. Elements that are closed within an area are seen as more related than elements placed outside of it. And lastly, we've got continuity. So this is the idea that our eyes will choose to see the smoothest path. So we choose to see this image as a straight line overlaid with a curve, even though that the colors we've used might suggest otherwise. We do use some of these ideas quite naturally when making visualizations. For instance, connection is basically a line plot. However, it can take more thought to effectively use some of these other ideas, such as enclosure or closure. So to show you how you can use the Gestalt principles in practice, I have this example. We're looking here at the average systolic blood pressure over 24 weeks, and we have 2 treatments and a placebo. We're interested in what effect each treatment has on systolic blood pressure. For context, a healthy systolic blood pressure is between 90 to 120 millimeters of mercury. So we've started our y-axis at 90. On average, patients in this trial start with high blood pressure. Now I'm going to make this easier and quicker to understand. So the first principle we're going to use is proximity. We've removed the legend and placed the labels next to the line of each treatment. Now the audience can read which label relates to each treatment as they look at the plot, instead of having to refer back and forth to the legend. Next, we've used similarity by changing the colors of the labels to match the colors of the treatment they represent. This is just a small difference, but it really further improves the association of the treatment to the line. And lastly, we're using closure by adding reference lines at significant readings. A blood pressure above 120 indicates elevated levels, and above 130 indicates high levels. These reference lines help to clearly show that both treatments lower the average classification from high to elevated throughout the trial, and that on average, patients on treatment A reach healthy blood pressure levels by the end of the trial. So here we've got a comparison of the before and after. And whilst the two graphs show the same information, the one on the right is much quicker to draw conclusions from by the addition of the suggested group elements. Just by rearranging the labels and adding in reference lines clearly shows the audience that by week 24, treatment B has reduced the average blood pressure from high to elevated, and treatment A has just about reduced average blood pressure to normal. I'll pass back to Hugh now for the next section.
Thanks, Sarah. We're now going to go through the final category of tips, which is all about improving the clarity of visualizations. So improving the clarity of visualizations is all about thinking about what you actually want to show, as well as thinking about any potential pitfalls that an audience might encounter, which might cause any confusion or misinterpretation when looking at your visualization. So the main way to accomplish that is think about how you can reduce the mental load put onto the audience when it comes to looking at your visualization. Because if you can avoid them having to strain to understand your visualization, then that can greatly increase its effectiveness. A lot of the tips I'm now going to talk about are to do with increasing the accessibility of the visualization. So some of those on a practical level, so making sure that all the text is legible. But then there's also maybe more sort of context-dependent tips, so making sure that the visualization doesn't assume information that an audience might not necessarily know. So this is the visualization that we're going to use for this category of tips. So this graph shows the mean number of lesions over time for two different treatment groups, placebo and treatment A. The two different lesion types under investigation are abscesses and inflammatory nodules. And just looking at the graph, we can see that the mean number of lesions over time seems to be lower on treatment A than placebo for pretty much the whole duration of the study. So the first tip in this section is to refine the message. And what this essentially means is you've got to think about what you actually want to show with your visualization. So in the previous graph, what we were interested in really was comparing the mean number of lesions between the two different treatment groups. So rather than having to show the absolute counts and letting the audience have to figure that out for themselves in their heads, by actually plotting the difference between the treatment groups over time, you can reduce that mental load upon the audience. So right now, the graph is, obviously temporarily harder to understand than the original, as it lacks explanatory information, which we'll add in future updates. But with the extra explanatory information, it'll become clearer how this is actually a refinement of the original graph, as by only plotting 2 lines instead of the original 4, we've halved the amount of plotting space required to present the same information. So our next tip is about being consistent with how you refer to different things in your visualizations. So in the 2 previous visualizations, we used the same red and blue colors to indicate treatment group as well as lesion type, which has the potential to cause confusion as well as misinterpretation. So since in this graph we're using color to refer to something new, the lesion types, we've chosen 2 new colors to avoid any potential confusion. So color is an easy example of how you might cause inconsistency to arise. But you should also think about other things as well. So for example, pattern is one possible quality that might cause inconsistency to arise. The next tip in this section is to consider using annotations such as text, reference lines, and arrows to help explain the visualization as well as provide context. So the annotation in this instance helps the audience to work out which way around the difference has been calculated, which avoids confusion. And the reference line also marks out to the audience where to look on the visualization. It kind of points out to the audience that whether points fall above or below the line is of primary interest when interpreting this particular graph. So it's not appropriate in all contexts, but this next tip is about using a title that sort of summarizes the graph and sort of states the message that you want the audience to walk away with. This works because if you have a good title, then the audience will first look at that and then look at the graph to exemplify the claims made in the title. So it's kind of just one way of speeding up the process of understanding, because rather than the audience having to look at the graph and then find the message themselves, if you first state the message and then the audience then finds that information themselves in the graph, it's one way of just speeding up the process of understanding. So the final tip in this section is all about harnessing white space. So that's about giving all the different elements in the visualization enough breathing space. This can sometimes be a bit subtle to spot, but here we've increased the space between the subtitle and the graph, as well as the x-axis label and the graph. This is one way of sort of just reducing the busyness of the graph to help create a more aesthetic visualization that the audience will like to look at. So here's just a quick before and after of the 2 visualizations, and hopefully you can see how with all the explanatory information and all the other steps that we've taken, the graph on the right, which we've improved, is much more user-friendly and much more easy to understand than the original graph. So I think I'm now handing over to Sarah for the final case study where she'll put together all the tips and tricks we've gone through. Oh, no, I'm not. There's another slide where I just give a couple more tips on accessibility. So the first one is about color blindness, which is about making sure that all your color choices are colorblind safe. Color blindness is surprisingly common, especially among men. There's a couple of different free tools online that you can use. So the Adobe Color Wheel is one such tool that I've used, which is pretty good. The second tip is to do with legibility. So that's about making sure that everything on your graphs is legible. It's particularly relevant for presentations that you do in person, as you want to make sure that the person at the end of the room can read everything on your visualization. And then the final tip is making sure that your visualizations have the right level of detail. So that's about keeping in mind what the audience will and will not necessarily know. So yeah, explain any jargon or abbreviations that the audience might not know, as that can impede the accessibility of the graph. So I think I am handing over to Sarah now to do the final case study.
Thanks, Hugh. Yep, so yeah, we'll now look at a final example, putting all these ideas discussed into practice. So here we've got our starting graph. So we're looking here at patient DLQI score. This measures the impact of skin disease on patient quality of life. It ranges from 0 to 30, with higher scores indicating more severe symptoms. The graph is following the progression of 10 patients over 7 visits. And from the onset, we can see that this graph is quite cluttered, and it can be difficult to follow individual patient progression and as well make sense of the overall trend. So we're going to apply what we've looked at to make this a much more effective graph. So the first few changes we're going to make are related to the text, starting with adjusting the text positions. So we've now left aligned the title to show its importance and right-aligned the footer to reduce its importance. Next, we're going to adjust the sizes. So we've made the title bigger to draw attention to it and reduce the size of the footnote and legend items to attract the attention from them. Now we're going to change the text colors. So we've made the title and axis labels darker and bolder, and we've made the footnote more muted. So now we're going to focus on the graph content. The previous visualization gave all of the subjects equal importance. Dialing the colors down can help you to focus on the actual data in the graph and what it might be showing. In this type of graph, we're generally more interested in the overall trend rather than individual patient trajectories. So the patient level data is used to give more of an idea of variation within the study. Here, we're implying grouped elements by using the ideas of proximity, similarity, and closure. We've added in reference lines at significant values, annotated these with explanatory descriptions, and used the same color for the lines and annotations to show that the annotations are related. This gives greater context to the data used in the visualization and helps the audience to start taking away insights from the graph. So as we previously mentioned, here we're more interested in the overall trend rather than individual trajectories. So actually plotting some kind of summary statistic over time helps to convey that message. The bright saturated blue is given much more status in the visualization when compared to the patient level data and the reference lines. Part of this point is also about distilling what is essential to the graph and what is redundant. Here, we also removed the y-axis label as it didn't add any extra information to the graph that the title didn't already provide. From the reference lines, the audience can deduce that higher values imply worse symptoms, but actually stating that on the graph means that they don't need to do the heavy lifting, and thus helps to improve the clarity of the visualization. And also notice how we've given the subtitle less importance than the title through the use of more muted colors and a slightly smaller text size. Here, we're updating the title to actually describe what's happening in the graph. The audience first sees the title and then look at the graph, which now exemplifies the claims made, which, provided are actually true, can speed up the process of understanding. And lastly, we're improving the breathing space of different elements. It can be subtle and difficult to see, but it's really one of the best tips to improve visualization aesthetics. Here, we've increased the space between the subtitle and the graph, the X label and the graph, and also the line annotations and the graph. So here we've got our before and after, and we can see that they are very different. So the most notable change when you look at it are the dialing down of the colors, the addition of the mean line, and the removal of the legend. We can now focus on the overall trend of the data without the noise of all the different colors, yet still keeping the individual data in the background to show variation. The audience is now no longer going back and forth trying to match each subject label to a specific line, which reduces effort on their part massively. And as well, for those unfamiliar to this therapeutic area, the addition of the subtitle and reference lines explains the implication of the DLQI scores, and it really helps with the interpretation. So I'll summarize the key points from mine and Hugh's presentation. So first, the best visualizations are easily understood and interpreted by their target audience. And we've provided several helpful suggestions on how you can achieve this. The first is creating a hierarchy among the different elements to give a clear structure and order to take the information in. Second, use techniques to group related elements within your visualization to help speed up the process of understanding. And lastly, focus on what you want to show and remove elements that clutter the visualization to avoid distracting the audience from this, and preventing them from having to strain. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and I'll pass back to Andrew.
Oh yeah, thanks, Sarah. So we'll jump into our Q&A section now. So feel free to add in some questions in that Q&A tab. We do have 2 already from Julia and Federica on the app. So I'll let Francesca take the lead on answering those.
Awesome, thank you. So I'll go to the first question here from Julia. So they say that the app looks nice and simple to follow. So thank you, it does. And asked, what platform did you use for developing the app? So this was written using R Shiny. We have our own team of very, very talented programmers. So while I can program in R, maybe not to that extent. So yes, actually Hugh and Sarah are in this programming team, and yeah, it was written using R Shiny. And the next question from Federica says, I can see the value in the app, the dashboard, but how do you ensure you're not ending up in a situation of cherry picking? And yes, this is a very, very good question. And I would say that that is exactly where our statistical expertise and our skills come into play. So an app can't prevent any of that. You know, it just, if you had to send tables and figures, that there's always going to be that risk. But what I think is important to highlight from how we did this with our stakeholders was that we were then there with them, guiding through the results and ensuring that, you know, those sort of things could not happen, because we are then providing the advice and the statistical expertise to, you know, to guide any conversations and help that dialogue and being able to discuss things there and then and in real time with them directly. And I think that's what's powerful about a dashboard is like this, is that it brings 2 parties together. It's not just us doing our bit and them doing their bit. We were actually able to do it all together. So it was very much a collaborative effort, which I think is really cool. Is there any last minute questions from anyone?
I think there's another question from Julia where she says, for the last case study, would smoothing the individual trajectories help to separate the individual observations or take it away from observed values too much? I'm not too sure what you mean by that question, but I think maybe it's saying, rather than kind of plotting the observed data as it is, where the lines are quite jagged and straight, maybe kind of like smoothing them out so it's more curves. So maybe like create a more aesthetic graph. I think like it's an interesting case of, you know, you want the graph to be accurate and like actually plotting the data, but sometimes like, you know, smoothing it out like that, you know, can maybe help to create a more aesthetic visualization. And I think in that case, it probably wouldn't detract too much from like the observed data. You also do that in other stuff, maybe like jittering data points and things. So I think that's yeah, definitely something you could do. I don't know what you think, Sarah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. It might still have some of the same kind of issues as the jagged lines, but I think it definitely would make it improve the overall aesthetics. As well, we've got a question from Katharina about how do we deploy our Shiny apps for our customers. And well, when I've made our Shiny apps, our client will have an internal system, and we build the R Shiny app on this internal system so that anyone else that has access can then just view the R Shiny apps.
Yep, definitely. And with our case, because we were working with the stakeholders directly, many of them like, you know, they're not statisticians, they're not going to be programming in R, so they don't actually have access to the app itself. But that was one thing that we definitely wanted, was that we were the ones that were able to deploy it and actually take them through it. So it was kind of like on our terms as the statisticians as to when and where we deployed that app. But yeah, as Sarah said, we have like our own internal systems that stores these things and allows us to deploy them to the different stakeholders or customers. I just see here, Freya says, that was really useful, thank you. So you are most welcome. And Yulia says, thank you for answering the question. And I got the question correctly. So brilliant, that's really good to know. And then Grace asks, who can access the R Shiny app? I mean, I think Sarah kind of said this anyway, but it's really just the users that have access to R itself, like in our internal client system. So it's not everyone that can use it, because we have to like run some code to actually get the dashboard deployed. I don't know if there's maybe anything, Sarah, Hugh, that you want to add to that?
No, I think, yeah, that's pretty much it. Anyone with access to R can get it running, and if someone didn't have access to R, then quite often people just will present it and share their screen. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. Well, it looks like that is all we have for questions today, which is brilliant. So thank you everyone again for attending. If you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to send them on to marketing@verimed.co.uk, or simply respond to the email that we sent out later this week with a recording of today's webinar so we can follow up. You can also learn more on our website at verimed.co.uk, and of course you can check out our previous and upcoming webinars at verimed.co.uk/webinars. And with that, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you. Bye.